On a quiet autumn afternoon, a skilled repairman, carrying nothing more than the scent of his work, crossed paths with a frail little girl on a stone staircase. Her voice barely more than a whisper as she made him an offer that would change both their lives forever. What began as a simple act of kindness would unravel a secret so powerful it would bind two strangers and a child in ways they never imagined. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video, and tell us where you are watching from. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Now, let's jump into the story. On an autumn afternoon, the air carried the cool breath of the season, weaving between tall apartment buildings. The sun hung low and pale, touching the glass windows with a fading light. Matthew Rhodes stepped out of the lobby of an upscale apartment complex, his boots making soft echoes on the stone walkway. He had just delivered a freshly repaired bicycle to a client and was on his way back to the street. The faint scent of oil still clung to his jacket, a reminder of the hours he had spent in his workshop earlier that day. As he walked, a small sound broke the calm. A cough, thin and rough, carried on the breeze. Matthew slowed, scanning the steps of the building. There at the bottom of the stone staircase sat a little girl. She was curled into herself, clutching a patched-up stuffed bunny to her chest. The fur of the toy was worn, its ears slightly bent, but it looked like it had been loved for years. Her dark hair tumbled in loose curls, hiding part of her pale face. She wore a soft blue sweater that seemed a size too big, the sleeves pulled over her small hands. Her breathing was uneven, each inhale a little too shallow. A hospital band circled her thin wrist, white against her skin. It was the kind of detail that caught Matthew's attention instantly. It was the same kind of band his younger sister had worn many years ago when she was sick. He stepped closer and crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "Hey, you okay?" His voice was gentle, steady, meant to put her at ease. The girl lifted her head slowly. Her eyes, though tired, were bright. "I'm just really tired," she said softly. "Mommy's upstairs, but—" Her words broke into another cough. When she caught her breath, she leaned slightly toward him, as if sharing something important. "If you help me upstairs, I'll tell you a secret." Matthew paused only for a moment, meeting her gaze. There was no hesitation after that. He slid one arm beneath her legs and the other around her back. She was so light it startled him, as though he were carrying nothing but the clothes she wore. The patched bunny rested between them, and he noticed a small sticker on it, a pale blue one, with the words "Pediatric Care" printed in neat letters. The meaning settled in his chest, quiet, but heavy. This little girl was facing something far bigger than her years. As they climbed the steps, the girl rested her head on his shoulder. Her voice came out in a whisper, so soft it was almost lost in the sound of their footsteps. "My mom is lonely," she said. "Can you take care of her when I'm gone?" Matthew froze mid-step. The words hit him harder than he expected. But when he looked down, her eyes were closed, a faint smile on her lips. He kept walking, holding her a little closer. At the top of the stairs, the door to an apartment opened. A woman with chestnut hair stepped into the doorway wearing a cream blouse and tailored trousers. Her expression tightened when she saw her daughter in the arms of a stranger. "What's going on? Who are you?" Her voice was guarded, but lined with concern. "She was sitting downstairs," Matthew said evenly. "She asked me to bring her up." The woman, Julia, stepped forward quickly, her hands reaching for the child. She pressed a hand to the girl's forehead, relief flickering through her features. "Thank you," she said, though her tone stayed careful. Before the door could close, the girl stirred. She looked at her mother, and then back at Matthew. "Mommy, this is Matthew. He's nice." Julia blinked but said nothing more. Matthew nodded once and turned toward the stairwell. As he descended, the image of the hospital band and the sound of her whispered words stayed with him. Outside, the streets stretched ahead, washed in the fading light. The leaves along the curb rustled in the wind, and Matthew kept walking, but his thoughts stayed on the little girl. Her request was not the kind of thing you could set aside. It had a way of settling in, pressing against the quiet spaces in his mind. That night, as he locked up his workshop, the memory of her pale face and determined eyes returned again and again. He could still hear the soft tone she had used, not with fear, but with a strange certainty. It wasn't a plea for help for herself. It was for her mother. Matthew didn't know her story yet, but he knew one thing. He would see her again. And as the autumn air deepened into evening, he found himself wondering what kind of secret could weigh so much on someone so small. The morning after meeting Clara, Matthew returned to the neighborhood for a routine job. A neighbor had asked him to fix a gear problem on a bike, and he set up near the curb, with his tools neatly spread on a small cloth. The crisp air carried the scent of damp leaves, and the quiet street seemed almost empty until he heard a familiar voice. Matthew. It was soft, but filled with recognition. He looked up to see Clara, walking slowly beside her mother, Julia. The little girl's curls bounced slightly with each careful step, her hand wrapped around her mother's fingers. Matthew stood and offered a small smile. "Morning." Clara's face lit up, and she let go of her mother's hand just long enough to move closer. "I still have more of my secret to tell you," she whispered, as though sharing something forbidden. Julia's brows rose slightly, but she said nothing, watching the exchange with guarded curiosity. "Then I guess we'll have to save it for the right moment," Matthew replied, his tone light. Julia gave him a polite nod before guiding Clara toward a waiting car. The encounter was brief, but it left Matthew with the sense that their paths were not finished crossing. Over the following days, those crossings became more frequent. Matthew would be in the building's lobby, replacing a flickering light bulb, or helping Mrs. Alden from the third floor carry heavy grocery bags to her apartment. Sometimes he would simply pass by, offering a nod or a short greeting. He never lingered, never pushed himself into their lives, but he was always there when needed. Julia noticed it. At first, she told herself it was coincidence. Yet there was something about the way Matthew carried himself, quiet, steady, attentive, that made it difficult to dismiss him as just another neighbor. Clara seemed to notice it too. Every time she spotted him, her eyes brightened and she would wave as if greeting an old friend. One Wednesday morning, Julia faced a problem. Clara had a follow-up appointment at the hospital, but Julia's office had called with news. An urgent meeting had been moved up, and it could not be missed. She stood in the lobby, phone in hand, running through options in her mind, when Matthew stepped through the glass doors. He was speaking briefly with the doorman when he noticed her. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "I have to be at work for an important call, but Clara needs to be at the hospital in an hour," Julia replied, frustration creeping into her voice. Without hesitation, Matthew said, "If you want, I can take her. I know the way, and I'll make sure she's back safe." Julia hesitated. "I can't, only if you're comfortable," he interrupted gently. "She knows me, and I'll text you when we get there." Clara looked up at her mother, hope written all over her small face. "Please, Mommy." After a long pause, Julia agreed. She watched as Clara walked beside Matthew toward his truck, the patched bunny tucked under her arm. At the hospital, Matthew waited with Clara in the brightly lit pediatric wing. While they sat in the corner, he told her a story about a boy who fixed bicycles and found treasure in the most unexpected places. Clara's laughter came in soft bursts, her eyes sparkling in a way that had been rare lately. The tension in her small shoulders seemed to ease. Julia arrived just after the appointment ended. She stood for a moment near the doorway, watching as Matthew knelt to tie the loose lace of Clara's shoe. There was something unspoken in the way he moved, a kind of patience that felt both rare and genuine. Later that week, Julia returned home to find a small cardboard box just inside her apartment door. Inside was a simple toolkit, screwdrivers, a wrench, pliers, all arranged neatly. On top was a folded note, in case something breaks. She held the note for a long moment. It was such a small thing, but the thoughtfulness behind it was impossible to ignore. As the days passed, her wariness began to fade. She didn't pull Clara away quite so quickly when they ran into Matthew. She didn't keep her conversations with him as short. Then came the storm. It started with rain tapping against the windows, building into a heavy downpour. By evening, the streets were running with water, and the wind pressed against the glass in restless bursts. Julia was pacing the living room when a small whimper made her turn. Clara was curled on the couch, her face flushed, her breathing shallow. Julia rushed to her side and pressed a hand to her forehead. Heat radiated from her skin. "Clara, can you hear me?" The girl stirred weakly, but didn't answer. Panic rose in Julia's chest. She called emergency services, but the voice on the line was grim. Several streets were flooded, and it would take at least 40 minutes for an ambulance to arrive. 40 minutes was too long. Without thinking, she scrolled to Matthew's number. Her fingers shook as she typed. "She's burning up. Can't breathe right." "No ambulance yet. Please help." The reply came almost instantly. "On my way." 7 minutes later, a knock rattled the door. Matthew stood there, rain dripping from his hair, his jacket soaked through. "Let's go," he said, stepping inside without hesitation. He scooped Clara into his arms, wrapping her in a blanket. Together, they hurried down the stairwell. His truck was parked close, engine running, headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. Julia climbed into the passenger seat while Matthew gently settled Clara in the back, shielding her from the storm. The drive to the hospital was tense and silent, except for the roar of water under the tires. Matthew's focus never wavered, his hands steady on the wheel. Within minutes, they pulled under the hospital's bright overhang, where nurses rushed to take Clara inside. Julia followed until she was stopped outside a curtained room, left with nothing to do but wait. Matthew sat beside her in the waiting area. He didn't speak or offer empty reassurances. Instead, he placed a warm hand on her shoulder, a quiet presence that grounded her in the middle of her fear. The minutes passed slowly, marked only by distant footsteps and the low murmur of voices. When the nurse finally returned to say Clara's fever had gone down and her breathing was improving, Julia felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease. She turned to Matthew. "Thank you for coming so fast." "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. But as they sat there, with the storm still raging beyond the glass doors, Julia knew this wasn't the last time she would need his help, and it wasn't just because of her daughter. The morning after the storm, the city was washed clean. Puddles glistened in the early light, and the air smelled faintly of wet concrete. Julia woke to the sound of Clara's even breathing from the next room. Relief settled in her chest, but her mind kept replaying the night before. Matthew's knock on the door, the urgency in his voice, the way he had driven through flooded streets without a second of hesitation. Later that week, Julia decided to thank him in person. She carried a box of pastries from a bakery downtown and 2 cups of coffee to his workshop. The space smelled of oil, metal, and faint traces of sawdust. Matthew was bent over a workbench, his sleeves rolled up, a streak of grease on his forearm. When he looked up and saw her, surprise flickered across his face. "Morning," she said, holding out the box. "I thought you could use a break." He smiled faintly. "You didn't have to do that." "Maybe not," she replied, "but I wanted to." As he set the pastries aside, Julia's eyes wandered around the workshop. She noticed an old photograph in a frame on the wall. It showed a younger Matthew in a casual jacket, kneeling beside a girl with bright eyes and a wide grin. Her hair was pulled back, and she looked about 9 years old. "She looks a little like Clara," Julia said softly. Matthew followed her gaze. For a moment, his expression changed. Something quieter, heavier. "That's my sister, Ella," he said. "She passed away when she was 10, leukemia." Julia hesitated, unsure what to say. "I was working far from home when she got worse," he continued. "By the time they told me how bad it was, I couldn't get back in time. I missed her last week." He paused, his voice lower now. "I've never forgiven myself for that." The words hung in the air between them. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Julia understood why he had carried Clara up the stairs without hesitation, why he had driven through a storm in the middle of the night. Matthew crossed to a drawer and pulled out a small, well-worn book. The cover was faded, its edges frayed, but the title still shone faintly in gold lettering. "This was Ella's favorite," he said, holding it out. "I kept it all these years. Maybe Clara would like it." Julia accepted the book carefully. "Are you sure?" "I am," he said simply. That night, Julia read from the book while Clara rested against her arm. The story was light and whimsical, filled with simple illustrations. When she finished a chapter, Clara hugged the book to her chest and said, "This one feels warm." Over the next few weeks, the hospital visits became more frequent. Clara's energy dipped, her cheeks lost their color, and the doctor began to speak in terms Julia had hoped never to hear. One afternoon, Dr. Patel called Julia into his office. The words came gently, but left a heavy mark. Clara's condition was worsening, and she needed a bone marrow transplant soon. Without it, her chances would fade quickly. Time became their enemy. The doctor spoke of finding a compatible donor, but matches could take months. Julia tried to stay composed, but inside she felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting. She kept the news from Clara, not wanting to burden her, but she didn't realize that someone else had already taken on that weight. Without telling Julia, Matthew began searching. After closing the workshop each night, he sat in the small office at the back, the glow of an old computer lighting his face. He combed through donor registries, sent emails to contacts from years ago, reached out to hospital staff and support networks. He filled out forms, made phone calls, and followed every lead, no matter how slim. A few days later, Matthew found Clara sitting in the lobby while Julia spoke with the concierge. She was quiet, her bunny toy resting in her lap. When she saw him, her face softened. "I heard Mommy talking to the doctor," she said. "She thinks I didn't hear, but I did." Matthew's voice was calm. "What did you hear?" "That I need a new part," she said slowly. "From somebody else's blood. It sounds scary, but I think I can be brave." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "If you take care of Mommy, I won't be scared." Her words struck him like a blow, but he didn't let it show. He placed his hand gently over hers. "You just focus on getting better. Let me handle the rest." Clara gave him a small, certain nod, as if sealing a promise. She leaned against his shoulder, and he held her there, silently vowing to keep her safe and to keep her mother from facing the fight alone. One cold morning, the call came. Julia had been dozing in a chair beside Clara's hospital bed when a nurse's voice broke through her half-sleep. "We found a match." For a moment, Julia couldn't speak. The words felt too fragile, like they might vanish if she breathed too hard. The nurse smiled gently. "The donor wishes to stay anonymous, but the match is excellent. We can schedule the transplant right away." Relief washed over Julia in a wave. Someone, somewhere, had chosen to give a part of themselves to save her daughter's life. Within hours, preparations began. Papers were signed, tests completed, schedules set. Julia kept thinking about the donor, imagining their face, wondering what made them choose to help a child they'd never met. She didn't know it yet, but the truth was closer than she could have imagined. The morning of the transplant arrived, with a pale winter light seeping through the hospital windows. Clara lay in her bed, clutching her patched bunny, while nurses moved quietly around her. Julia stayed close, brushing Clara's hair back from her forehead, whispering promises she hoped she could keep. When it was time, the double doors closed, leaving Julia standing in the hallway with her heart pounding. Hours passed in slow motion. She paced the waiting room, sat for minutes that felt like hours, then stood again, unable to settle. Finally, the surgeon appeared, his expression calm. "The procedure went well," he said. "She'll be in recovery for the next day or two, but everything looks good." Relief made her knees weak. She wanted to thank the donor, to look them in the eye and tell them they had saved her daughter's life. But the staff told her the donor had chosen to remain anonymous. For the next 2 days, Julia stayed at Clara's side. The girl's cheeks began to regain a little color, her breathing steadier, her smile returning in small flashes. Yet through it all, Matthew never came by. His absence weighed on Julia's mind. He had been there for every hard moment before this. Why not now? On the 3rd day, she called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. By the 4th, she decided to find him. She drove to his workshop, the familiar smell of oil and metal greeting her as she stepped inside. It was quieter than usual, the sound of tools absent. In the small office at the back, she found him sitting at the desk, his left arm in a sling. "What happened?" she asked, her voice edged with worry. Matthew looked up, surprise in his eyes before a faint smile formed. "I guess they told you about the donor." The realization hit her all at once. "It was you." He shrugged slightly, as if it were nothing. "I promised Clara I'd do whatever I could." Julia stared at him, the weight of his choice settling over her. "You went through surgery and didn't tell me." "It wasn't about me," he said simply. "It was about her, about giving her a chance." Her throat tightened, but she found no words that could match the moment. She saw him differently now, not just as the man who had carried her daughter up the stairs or driven through a storm, but as someone who had quietly risked his own health with no thought of thanks or recognition. 2 weeks later, Clara's 5th birthday arrived. The apartment was bright with balloons and filled with the soft hum of conversation. The scent of vanilla cake mixed with the fresh flowers on the table. Julia moved through the room, greeting guests, but her eyes kept drifting to the door. Matthew arrived just as the candles were being placed on the cake, holding a small, neatly wrapped box. He hesitated in the doorway until Clara spotted him. "Matthew," she called, running to him in her pink dress dotted with stars. She wrapped her arms around his waist before pulling him toward the center of the room. When they reached Julia, Clara looked up at her with pride. "This is the person who helps you smile," she announced for everyone to hear. The room grew quiet for a moment, and Julia felt warmth rise to her cheeks. She met Matthew's eyes and saw no embarrassment there, only steady calm. Slowly, she knelt to Clara's level. "Yes, sweetheart, I know." Later, as the candles flickered, Julia leaned toward Matthew, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "Thank you, not just for saving her life, but for giving both of us something we didn't know we needed." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, cake, and soft moments. Matthew stayed close without being in the way, tying loose balloons back to chairs, helping clear plates, fixing the wheel on a doll stroller one of the children had brought. Every gesture carried the same quiet care he had shown from the start. When the guests had gone, the apartment was still except for the faint hum of the city outside. Julia stepped onto the balcony, the night air crisp against her skin. Matthew joined her, his jacket unbuttoned, the breeze stirring his hair. Clara appeared moments later, climbing onto the bench between them. She wrapped her arms around both their waists. "See," she said softly, "this is how a family feels." Julia smiled, her hand resting lightly on Matthew's arm. He looked down at Clara, then at Julia, and for a moment, no one spoke. The lights of the city glittered beyond them, and the air was filled with a quiet sense of something whole. What had begun with a small girl on a stone staircase had become something neither of them had expected. A story not just of survival, but of connection, of love built slowly through kindness and choice. Matthew had gained something he thought he had lost forever, and Julia had found someone she didn't know she was waiting for. And Clara, in her simple and certain way, had gotten exactly what she had wished for.